Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this panel. This is Sourcing Trusted Data to Enable Contextual Decisioning for Graph-Based Customer 360 Insight. And our panelists are from OneTrust, Quantexa, and also from Deloitte. So with no further ado, let me go ahead and introduce our panelists for today. First, let me say and welcome Richard Love, who's Senior Director with Deloitte Digital. Richard, good to have you. Next, I'd like to
be here.
Yeah, good to have you. And next, I'll introduce Martin Maisey, who's Head of Contextual Decision Intelligence Solutions at Quantexa. Martin, great to have you. Awesome. And then from there, our final panelist, Raj with OneTrust, who leads Strategic Account Specialist and also Data Governance at OneTrust. So Raj, great to have you on the panel as well.
Thanks, Mike. Good to be here with everyone.
Yeah, super. So, it was a interesting starting title. And what I'm going to ask is, Martin, if you don't mind, can you help set the stage for our audience about this particular topic and provide some insight to this idea of Customer 360? So over to you for a few slides to update our audience.
Fantastic, thank you. So gaining insight into customers based on a true 360-degree view is one of the most pressing analytics use cases for organizations today. And I think it's worth putting it in the wider context of some eye-opening recent research from IDC. So they class only 5% of analytics adopters as high-performing. And this group are seeing real, very significant results. But that's where the good news ends. So although the vast majority of that group believe that analytics operationalized in real time delivers high business value, even they, out of them, less than half have achieved it. And 4 times as many companies, that's 20%, aren't seeing any return on huge investments.
Wow.
Only 15% of organizations overall are making progress with automated decisions. And only 10% of data is being used for analytics. And respondents laid much of the blame for this at the door of data management. Next slide, please. So most organizations still lack a data integration architecture. No single version of the truth and variable quality data are still problems in the majority of organizations. It's difficult for analysts and data scientists to discover, understand the lineage of, and use data. And it's difficult for everyone, including business users, to trust data. And the customer world is a particularly acute example of this. So reporting across divisions is cumbersome and manual. Sales teams don't have access to the information and insights they need to really proactively and meaningfully engage with customers. Risk is not fully understood due to a myopic view of clients and relationships. You've got inefficient operations driving up costs, really difficult to comply with regulations. But overall, customers are suffering poor, fragmented experiences across digital and physical channels. And the underlying data is a big part of the problem. So dealing with personal data brings huge data volumes and significant compliance requirements, and I know we'll talk about that later. There are very many touch points across entities with siloed data across regions, product lines, business divisions. It's difficult to connect data across disparate internal and external sources. And finally, everyone has a different perspective on what customer means. And these problems are holding back at least 3/4 of companies in their operational integration of advanced insight and decision that's based on it. But at the same time, we've got some great new approaches and technology coming to the fore that can revolutionize the way we unlock unlock value from customer data. And I'm very much looking forward to talking about them today. So back to you, Mike.
Awesome, Martin, and thank you for setting context. I'm basically hearing this dualistic message of tremendous opportunity and quite a bit of challenges, many in the area of data management and this idea of the 360 view, how to supply that and the trust around it. So let's get on to the panel discussion. And Martin, if you were kind enough to help us with the opening, I'm going to put the first question to you, which is, how are graph technologies being used to transform business?
So as background, Gartner have a strategic planning assumption, which I think is illuminating, that by 2025, graph technologies will be used in fully 80% of data and analytics innovations, and that's up from 10% this year. And I think one of the big reasons for that is that graph is creating a strong foundation for bringing together the currently siloed data that's needed for insight and decisions. And organizations have traditionally tried to do this by forcing data into enterprise schema, and those take a long time to design. And then it's costly, slow, and really hard to adapt in an agile way, as data from new parts of the organization needs to be incorporated. One of the big things graphs can do is enable data to be onboarded, connected, and used without a common schema, and to preserve fidelity rather than working to a lowest common denominator. So the second aspect is that they're also really ideal for representing some of the complex relationships that are present in the real world. And 360-degree insight shouldn't just be about who your direct customer is and how they're interacting with you. It should be about their relationships, what they're sharing and what they're sharing with others and how they interact with others. And then not just those, but their relationships again. And that should go out as far as is useful. And a really great example of this is business customers, who people often think are simple, but in actuality, they have complex, deep hierarchies. They've got things like informal relationships through shared directors. They've got supply chains and so on and so on. And one of the very first areas of application of graph technologies was in finding some of the customers that you really don't want on your books. For financial institutions, detecting and investigating money laundering activity has historically been a huge challenge. And that's because the indicators are deliberately obscured and include things like complex flows and cycles of money, very well suited for graph. And in this area, graph-based detection models can deliver 95% fewer false positives, and they can flag far more genuinely suspicious activity whilst doing so. So they're also really great for finding customers that you do want on your books. And for commercial prospecting, we found a 90% time reduction with a 50% conversion increase when looking for referral opportunities through shared directors, as I mentioned earlier. So getting this kind of success isn't guaranteed. You need to create the right graph, and then you need to use that graph right. That said, despite some of those challenges, leading enterprises are now finding enough value from graph-based approaches that they're looking to move beyond tactical use in point applications to building out graph-based data platforms on an enterprise-wide scale, and those will be serving widely varying use cases. So that's a hard thing to do with most technology today, because those different use cases need different graphs. But get it right, and it can be a great basis for data utilities or data fabrics that can create a dynamic view of customers, and in particular, including real-time updates on those customers' rapidly changing relationships and attributes.
Martin, thank you for setting the stage. I'm really hearing you say that if this is done right, you can solve things that were unachievable before. But there's a backdrop to this, and Raj, I'd invite you on this question, which is, what are the main factors that can determine whether data is verified as trusted? Because all of the capabilities that Martin covered, if you don't trust your underlying data, it's really a blocker, or you're taking significant risk as you carry forward. So what's your take on that?
No, absolutely, Mike, and it's a really good point. And I've just noticed somebody in the audience here. Her and I, she leads a data governance practice at one of our partners, and we had this similar conversation around what are the proof points that you can provide to people to demonstrate data is trusted. And a lot of it is also around process. So what sort of process do you have from source data to actually putting it into the hands of individuals? So being able to show accountability, and also people who are accountable for that as well, because it's all very well having an automated process that looks at source data, classifies it as good or bad or needing further interjection. And then how do you present that? And actually having that process that somebody then goes through and actually says, I accept or I reject, then that fuels the trust piece to actually deliver that data. Now, putting into the background of that some sort of AI and machine learning capability that learns over time, that says, well, the more approvals or rejects that I do, I can then start to automate some of the back activities that then determine when I receive new data or I see new data, how can I mark that as trusted or reject that or highlight that for an individual's approval to say, yes, I need to inspect that further before I determine that's good data. Presenting that in that light and then passing that forward means that then that data intelligence can be passed into the platform that Martin's been talking about to drive those decisions, but you can trust the input and the quality of the data to be able to drive those decisions as well.
Awesome. We're going to move on to this idea or question of retention, which is retention is becoming more important as organizations look to use relevant data that is not out of date. So what is the most effective way to manage retention? Raj, can you pick up on that just to carry forward on that discussion?
Absolutely. And so my background is in data management and helping organizations to build data pipelines. And historically, just because somebody's been presented with the data, it's assumed that that data is fit for purpose. The relevant policies and regulatory requirements have been applied to that data. That assumption is out of date and no longer applies. And if we look at very simple concepts of retention policies that organizations have to adhere to, applying that to that data pipeline to say it's all very well presenting that data and making that data available, but does it satisfy policy? So if you've got a 7-year retention period for data and data sits outside of that, who do we need to alert and what actions do we need to take? And that action could be a case of deleting some of that data or marking it for deletion or even redacting it in some cases as well. So putting a mechanism in place that, again, automates that process, understands when that data was generated, understands when that data lapses that retention policy, and then the action that needs to be taken off the back of that as well. And doing that on a continuous basis, because doing it as a snapshot, as a point in time, doesn't make sense, because continuously that data needs to be validated that it satisfies those retention policies.
Awesome. Martin, do you have a quick add to this topic of retention?
Yes, absolutely. And I think what I'd say is that this is not just one way as a data feed. One of the really important points here is that a lot of retention decisions are made around a customer. So you can't necessarily make a good retention decision unless you've got a good idea of who your customer is.
Awesome. And let's move into this idea. Richard, I want to bring you into this discussion. So I have a question for you, which is, have you seen Graph used to better drive the 360 view of business? Does this really happen in the marketplace? What are your thoughts on that?
Fine. No, let me pick that one up. And it's a great question. Yeah, because actually, I think we need to recognize, though sometimes it's easy for us to forget because we live in this world, that data is the enabler here. And actually, it's the business that's really important. And so I'd like to look at this very much through that business perspective. And hey, single customer view, it's one of those terms, it's been around for ages, hasn't it? And you know, I thought some of those stats up front were really interesting, but I recognize that. So the question really for me is, so what's changed? You know, why is the business still trying to look at single customer view? And the bit I would say something I've seen change quite a lot is really comes down to two sets of decisions. One is the need for contextual insight, whether it's first of all coming from very much the defensive side of the house, but actually much more in the front office. We're seeing organizations ask questions such as, how do I manage the customer continuum the whole way through? Not just every touch point, but as a customer goes from being maybe a student to then being, somebody that then may have a family to then maybe have a business. How do I understand all of that to make the best possible decision? And that's about how do I connect it all? As simple as that. The second point for me then is actually there's this huge drive to obviously digitization and to create a simpler bank. So very much then coming from the CFO type world is, how do I create a simpler bank? Give you an example. I can certainly think of one organization I've been working with that recognized that its customer data was held across 21 different data warehouses across the organization. And something like 10% of the bank's cost base was dealing with customer management in such form. There's a lot of overlap and a lot of duplication going on there.
Absolutely.
So how can I create a much, much simpler type of bank? So these two things, I think, are making the need for much more contextual insight and graph much more important. And they're also driving this to becoming a C-suite issue. It doesn't exist within one part of a business or a business area. To really solve this, you need to look across the enterprise. And that means it needs to start high up in the organization to really drive that. You've then got, if you then flip it and then go, so if those are the questions businesses are asking, why are they turning to graph? And I think they're turning to graph because of some of the points we've just talked about the complexity of hierarchies, the idea that you can create a single solution that everybody will come and use just doesn't exist. It has to be much more flexible. So we see organizations trying to create not one, but maybe multiple, but fewer single customer views. But how do you link them together? And you need that when you're then talking about real-time contextual insight and different businesses wanting to move at different speeds, but it needs to be business driven. If you can't bring the business in, if you can't drive the value and demonstrate the value, it's never going to happen. So those are some of the sort of key things that we see. And the other thing, I was very interested with what Joe was saying right up front about a lot of data management being driven out of the regulatory or financial crime space. And what we're increasingly seeing is businesses recognizing actually that capability can be used across other parts of the organization. So this view increasingly, we've seen people talking about a customer data utility. So which underpins everything. In other words, the customer profile, the network and associated data to feed all use cases. And those are the things we see the business talking about.
Awesome, Richard. A lot of pieces to this. And my takeaway is one of the keys to essentially having the opportunity is not just the technology, the platforms, the trusted data, but is to have the top of the house bought in to this approach. And if that doesn't happen, achieving it for the enterprise is a very heavy bottom-up lift. So let's move on to this 100%. Next question. Yeah, exactly. What are the steps, and this is going to frame this to Raj with Martin to follow up, what steps can organizations take to maintain regulations requirements without inhibiting the use of data? It's that yin or yang, right? We have to be very careful about our protected sensitive data, yet at the same time, there are opportunities, if it's properly anonymized, et cetera, to create great opportunity. How do you do that? That sounds incredibly like a hard decision no one wants to make.
So it's a good point, because so the phrase I use is, let's not put obstacles in our own way, because we're very good at doing that as individuals, as organizations as well. However, it's difficult to do because on one hand, you've got InfoSec people, you've got compliance managers who add to that burden of saying, right, how do I make sure my data is compliant? You've got business users who want the speed, want the agility to say, well, I need that data immediately because I'm data driven. I want to use better insights to drive decisions that I want to make. And so you're absolutely right, that yin and yang, that pull from both sides. And so having a mechanism that automates a lot of that process, pulls insight from outside of the organization. So you talked about regulatory, authorities, regulations that are in place as well. Using a trusted mechanism where all that data and information already exists. So when you have data, you know which of those regulations that data has to apply to, but also the policies that you've got in place and validating against those policies. So what you have is a streamlined approach in terms of making that data available that's marked as trusted. So somebody says, I know it's been through a process. I know it's validated externally and internally as well. I can then leverage that data and use that data. So reducing that time, automating that, and making that readily available to make sure the business users stay invested in the use of that data to drive what they want to do. That end-to-end process is difficult. But if you manage that from an end-to-end capability and have people, processes, and technology, the data stewards, data custodians, data owners, system owners invested in that process with stakeholder support, that can be achieved readily as well.
Awesome. Martin, you want to add to this? And we're going to take an audience question in a moment, but I figured quick perspective on Raj's response in your ad.
Yeah, so one point, which is just to say that regulatory compliance, what the regulators want to see is things being clear and rigorous, and along, as Raj says, the end-to-end process. But these are actually, in many cases, what the users want to see as well, or the people who are consuming it. Now, I don't think it is a yin and yang. The two things overlap, and done right, compliance can benefit everyone.
Awesome. So here's an audience question. Richard, I'm going to throw it over to you, and it's from Stephen Tuck, and it's as follows. Is a single view of the customer just needed for insight, or is it an operational single customer view required to service customers consistently for inbound and outbound contact, irrespective of the channel? So it's that sort of, are we just looking for insights, or is it the holistic serving of the customer? What's your take on that question from Stephen?
Thank you, Stephen. It's a great question. Look, it's very definitely the latter, but then I think it's even broader than that, because actually we're using it, as the way I look at it, risk, finance, credit, and the customer should all be working off that same single core view of the entity and the customer. However, Stephen's absolutely right. It's incredibly important when we look at it from the customer's perspective. It's actually being used to enable us to provide a better experience and a better service to the customer, frankly, whatever touch point, whatever channel. And the ability to do that requires us just to be able to understand, customer may start on so much now that they may be starting online, but then go to mobile and then want to talk to somebody. And it could be a service question or it could be a marketing question. But the business needs to be able to have the information from that previous interaction to be able to respond to it, whatever the point is.
Awesome. So Richard, and for our panelists, this has been a great primer discussion. I mean, we could go on for a while, but we also want to give a few minutes to allow you just to update with some final takeaways and a little bit about your organizations if people want to learn more about trusted data or the ability to leverage the 360 view, both phenomenally important requirements. So let's go on to key takeaways. I'd like to start first with Raj. What is your takeaway for this audience? They're going to go back to business. If you were them, what would be that single thought here that you'd like them to carry away with? And then we'll go on to Martin and then Richard.
Absolutely. So when we look at data activities, data-driven activities, the key thing that I certainly say is, how will you impact the business? What metrics will you use to actually impact the business, and also who the stakeholder will be within that as well? Because we need a driver for all of this activity. Otherwise, it just becomes something that someone complains about and says, I've got this issue, I need to address it. How are you going to, in a measurable way, impact the business, and who cares about it? As soon as we find that, absolutely helps them. Awesome.
Martin, over to you for your key takeaway.
Yeah, so Graph is the most natural way to provide a 360-degree view of your customer. But one of the really important things to do is to make sure it represents the real world. Otherwise, you won't be able to find the right context for an insight or decision. The other aspect is that there's a huge opportunity that we've not really talked about to drive improvement of data itself by mastering data out of a graph, by assessing data out of a graph. So again, it's a case of creating that loop that comes all the way around and improves data and decisions.
Awesome. Richard, your final remark before we go into the company updates?
Fine, lovely. And I'll pick up on this. You picked it up earlier, Mike. For mine is, look, this is a C-suite issue. Everything that we've talked about, the changes that we talked about, the benefits, none of this happens unless you've got that buy-in at that level. Because we are talking about we're talking actually about moving that idea of the customer here to be something that's owned by the organization, that term party. That requires buy-in at the top level to drive that forward.
So I'm picking up, if you're working on this project, check and make sure top of the house is involved. That's how you'll get things to happen. make sure that's part of how you build your program. So to our three panelists, thank you. Let me go ahead and share my screen. So hopefully everyone can now see that. Let me try that one more time. There we go. Awesome. There's always a little bit of a lag. So what I'd like to do is, Martin, just quick on Quantexa, a little bit about, in 2 slides, your solutions and how people can find out more, and then we'll do that with Raj.
Okay, great. So Contextual is a data and analytics software company. We're about 350 people now, and we've been pioneering meaningful data and trusted decisions through what we call contextual decision intelligence and bringing context to decisions since 2016. Our platform provides a contextual connected view of internal and external data, and a big use of that is for 360-degree view of customers. We provide 4 main capabilities. So entity resolution, finding the real world entities in your data. Network generation is finding the relevant bits of the big graph that we've identified by doing it for a given decision. Contextual analytics are pulling out context that can be used for AI, contextual features, scores and so forth, and a UI for augmented decision making. And we can provide that at an enterprise scale, so we can handle multiple use cases from a single instance. Next slide. So we've been working with Deloitte since 2017, been lucky to do that, and they've brought their vast customer and integration experience to bear in delivering solutions based on the Quantexa platform and maximizing value for customers whilst doing so. So I think in particular, I'd like to thank Mike for joining us. It's been a pleasure speaking with all of you today, including Mike and the rest of the panel. So if you'd like to get in touch with us, do email us at info@quantexa.com. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Martin. And Raj, over to you about the OneTrust platform and capabilities.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mike. So yeah, really, when I talked about trusted data and the process that we go through, this kind of shows it at a very high level. I don't go into too much detail, but it's about looking at actual data, scanning data, pulling that metadata together, and applying, going back to the point that you made and Richard made as well about, business users have to come into this, and you've got to allow for some business semantics through a glossary here as well, and then applying some sound governance and processes around that. And on the next slide, you'll see that forms as part of a platform. So, we have a single instance, a cloud platform that's built on a single code base, all integrated together, and the capabilities around the OneTrust data governance module is what we've been talking about here. But certainly, there's more capabilities that exist as we broaden that out as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Raj. Thank you to OneTrust. Also, thank you to Quantexa and to Richard with Deloitte. Excellent discussion, and a lot more everyone can learn by visiting and talking with you. So with that, as a follow-up at this stage, the next panel, just so everyone's aware of, you have 2 choices. Again, thanks to our panelists for this session. You have this choice to either go visit data management as custodians versus owners of data with Data Dynamics, or how to maximize the value of first-party data with Big ID. Just go to your agenda tab, and we'll see you over there in a few moments. And thank you to everyone on this panel. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you all.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.
Cheers.